joined today by Joe O'Connor, who is one of the world's foremost experts on the shorter work week. He's the CEO and co-founder of Worktime Reduction, which is a consulting and research organization that specializes in the shorter work week models and outcomes-focused working. Prior to Worktime Reduction, as the CEO of 4-Day Week Global, Joe developed the world's first pilot program of the 4-day working week. Joe's conducted research projects with Boston College, University College Dublin, and Cornell, to name a few. And Joe's here today to talk about the history and hopefully a bit of the future of the work week. So thanks for coming, Joe.
No problem. Great to join you, Henry. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't we start with the history of the standard work week? I'm not sure if people know how we ended up with the 40-hour, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday sort of thing. How did that all take shape throughout history?
Sure. So I think often when you speak to someone about the shorter work week or the 4-day work week, and you get a response which is very much that, it's kind of unrealistic or it's some kind of crazy concept that just couldn't work for business. They're very much looking at this through the paradigm of what we've all become accustomed to in recent decades, which is totally understandable. But once you kind of zoom out a bit and you look at the work week and how it came about as it's constructed today, you kind of recognize that it's more than 2 centuries ago since the start of the campaign for the 8-hour day, the 5-day week, the weekend first started. So if you see some of that imagery around, 8 hours rest, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours labor, it was very civil society driven movement. And it took more than 100 years after that before Henry Ford introduced this within his own manufacturing company in the United States. And it took about a decade then again after that before this became popularized and before it became enshrined in legislation in most of the Western world. And that was at a time when, really we were shifting to a more industrial, to a more manufacturing-based economy, and those kinds of advances in productivity and technology made that change possible. So I guess for a lot of us that are looking at this and that are arguing for this, there's a recognition that the 5-day week that we currently have is very much a man-made construct that was very intentionally designed for a particular point in time that may not necessarily be as relevant to today's work and today's workforces.
You recently released a report that I thought was interesting in the introduction to it. You mentioned the economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that his grandkids might work 15 hours a week as a result of technology gains, productivity gains, better ideas happening, which clearly hasn't happened.
No problem. Great to join you, Henry. Thanks for having me.
Why do you think that hasn't happened? Why haven't things changed?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that prediction that Keynes made all the way back in 1930 is that if you take it on face value, you'd say, he must be pretty bad at predictions because, we're not working anything like a 15-hour work week. But that was the only part that he got wrong, because he believed that this would be brought about by really incredible advances in productivity and technology. And of course, he got that part completely right. We've seen things like the advent of the internet, email and digital communications technologies. We've globalized trade all within the last number of decades. But yet our standard work week and the number of hours that people are working on average has stayed largely unchanged during that period. And he wasn't the only major public figure to make a prediction like that. The former US President Richard Nixon, he believed in 1956 that we were on the cusp of a 4-day work week, which he said at the time would lead to a fuller and a fairer family life for every American. I think now as we enter this, particularly in the last 12 months, we've seen the Gen AI, large language models, all of these new technologies. And I know we're going to talk about that in more detail later, but I think it's a good time to kind of ask if there is an opportunity maybe to respond to this new wave of technology maybe in a slightly different way to how we've responded to some of the changes that we've seen in the last century.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the last 12 months with AI. If you sort of back up the past 3 years more with the COVID stuff, that obviously reshaped how people view the office for sure, right? Like everyone sort of woke up and said, "Whoa, we don't have to drive into an office every day to do work on our computers," and that has really shaken everything up about where work is done. I'm curious to know from you, has that changed perceptions as well on when work is done or how often work is done?
I would say, you'll know from your work with Build Remote that remote work wasn't made possible by COVID. It was made permissible. We already had the technologies in terms of, virtual meeting software, video conferencing, asynchronous communications tools. All of this stuff we had at our disposal pre-COVID. All that happened was that the idea that you could run a global company from your kitchen table became something that was acceptable within the business world, at least to some extent. I know we've seen some backtracking on that in recent times. So I think it's very similar with the shorter work week. I would argue that we already had the productive capacity and the technological tools to achieve just as much, if not more, in less time, well before COVID. But what's changed is that I think it's led to leaders becoming more open-minded to rethinking work,
Yep.
redesigning new work models. I think we've already seen shifts towards, outcomes-based measurement as a result of companies being forced to move, either permanently or at least temporarily to remote work or remote first work models. And then there's the demand side. I think that, for employees, I think our collective experience during COVID changed something in all of us in terms of how we set our priorities and the things that are really important and that really matter most to us. I think as a result of that, I think, that the value that people place on having that additional time, for family, for friends, for community, for learning new skills, hobbies, and endeavors, I'd argue that that's really ramped up, and that's kind of materializing in the shorter work week being, according to most sentiment studies that you look at in the US and Canada and the UK and elsewhere, this is the single most attractive thing that you could offer your workforce if you're serious about retaining your best people and attracting top talent. So COVID has been a total game changer when it comes to this idea of the shorter working week. We had a period where there were some experiments with shorter work weeks back in the 70s and 80s. They were largely unsuccessful. They were largely unsuccessful because they were based on compressed hours. They were based on, asking people to work the same number of hours in fewer days. And the results were unsurprisingly negative on two fronts. First of all, for lots of people, they were actually feeling more burnt out because they were working 4 very long days. And on the other side of things, from a productivity standpoint, people were experiencing that, often they weren't as productive in their 9th or 10th hour as maybe they were in their 1st or 2nd hour of a Friday. So we've seen a 20 or 30 years where things have been pretty quiet in terms of those predictions that Keynes and Nixon made. And this has just started to come back to the forefront. A little bit we saw it before COVID. Some governments in Iceland and Denmark were experimenting with this. We saw some companies transitioning to this. But the pandemic has been the springboard, I think, for a new wave of interest in this concept.
Is there any correlation between fully remote companies and companies that also will consider a shorter work week? Do you see that or no?
I do and I don't, Henry. So there was a big correlation during during the real throes of the pandemic. And that was largely driven by the fact that we saw a lot of companies who were already fully or mostly remote before COVID, who were turning to the shorter work week because, they used to have a competitive advantage within their industry because they were offering people flexibility and work from home options. All of a sudden, the pandemic came along and their competitive advantage, their kind of differentiator, was gobbled up almost overnight. Everybody was offering these things. And so a lot of those companies started turning to the shorter work week, really to try and regain their competitive edge and their differentiation. We also saw for lots of companies who moved to remote models during COVID that, they found that things like asynchronous communications, things like outcomes-based measurement, some of the real fundamental things, which you'll see in the report that we've just published in collaboration with the Josh Bersin company, some of the kind of the critical success components to making a shorter work week work, they had already successfully put those things in place in order to shift to remote. So there's no question, this can sit very ably alongside a remote first operating model, but it can also work in hybrid work environments. We've seen companies with structured flexibility models where they have two days with people in the office and 2 days with people working from home, where they're offering a 4-day work week. And then interestingly, and this is not something that, I assume this isn't something you'll feel great about, it's not something I necessarily feel great about, but we've seen an increase in organizations looking at the shorter work week almost as a back to the office policy, where they want to get people back in the office to a greater extent. For some industries, this is because they have to. In other industries, it's because, leadership have a more old school, traditional mindset and approach to work. So they want to see people back in the office to a greater extent. But they know that, if you're not Salesforce or you're not Meta or you're not one of these giants, you probably can't afford to have a very aggressive back to the office policy without that damaging your ability to attract and retain staff. So they're actually looking at this and they're saying, well, if we want to get people back in more, why don't we maybe offer a shorter work week? And, we've seen data in the UK where Hayes Recruitment surveyed about 15,000 employees and give them a binary choice. Do you want to work 4 days fully in the office or 5 days hybrid? And 2/3 of people chose 4 days fully in the office, which was surprising to me, to be honest with you. Yep. So I don't think that should be a binary choice. I think that we should be focused on outcomes rather than location of work. But I think it does speak to the fact that the motivation for why leaders and organizations are doing this has changed and is constantly changing over the course of the last number of years.
Yeah. I wanted to just support something you said at the beginning of your answer there. Before I started Build Remote, I ran a fully remote marketing agency for 6 years. I worked there for 8 years. And we were one of the only remote companies out there. So we would post a job for essentially anywhere for English speakers, which is a huge talent pool. And we would get like 300 something applications. And then we tried to make the same exact hire, like pretty much duplicating a job post during COVID. Maybe it was 2021, I think. And we had maybe like 30 applicants because exactly what you said, our advantage being remote had completely been wiped away. We became a 4-day workweek company in 2020. Before that hire, we just weren't announcing it anywhere as like a benefit. We had decided we wanted to offer it to our employees and to our new hires, but we weren't going to promote it in our hiring process. And then we realized we had to, and then all the applicants came back again. So it just exactly what you said happened at our company. It's like spot on what you said. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and it's not just a trade-off between flexibility and time. Is also a time-money trade-off here. So we're seeing organizations doing this where, let's take not-for-profits. For most not-for-profits, they find it very difficult to compete on salary with for-profit employers when it comes to recruiting similar job roles. So we've seen this become a great opportunity for not-for-profits to actually become more competitive vis-a-vis private sector employers if they're offering something like a shorter work week. You take small tech companies trying to compete for engineering talent with the very large tech companies where they're just able to offer much higher salary levels. Again, shorter work weeks offers an opportunity there. And I think, if you look at what we described in terms of why has the work week and average working hours stayed relatively static over the course of the kind of 20 to 30 years leading up to COVID? I mean, part of this can be attributed to, if you look at the academic literature around this, the fact that unionization, collective bargaining coverage was dropping quite significantly, and that had previously been a big driver of negotiated reductions in work time. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, there was a big element of this that was around choice, that we had a number of decades where people's preferences were for consumption over leisure. People were prioritizing more money over more time. And I think there's a strong case to be made that we're starting to see a change in that, particularly for Gen Z workers, where, younger generations of workers now are saying things like experiences, things like environmental sustainability, things like more time off. These are things that, I'm not going to say they matter more than money, but for a lot of people, they might matter just as much. And that's something that I think has definitely changed in recent years. And I think as Gen Z and younger workers over time start to make up a bigger proportion of the overall workforce, I think you're only going to see demands for things like a 4-day work week continue to build momentum.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, another way to describe money is stored time. You've put in the work and the time, and you've been paid for it. And after spending on your daily life and what you need, you have stored, hopefully, savings would be an excess amount of time you've built up. So it makes sense that people are saying, I could either use some of that time now while I'm young, right, and use it for other things, or I can store it all for retirement, which is sort of an older school mindset, and store all that time into the future and use it much later. So it makes sense to me that people are reconsidering time and money, which is a big one.
And the other point that I actually just heard Josh Bersin make on his podcast about the report we released last week, and I actually hadn't heard this argument before. I hadn't really considered it before, but I feel like there's a lot of truth to it. One thing that's changed that we maybe haven't fully recognized is that our career span has extended very significantly in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So, when he was kind of, starting employment, for a lot of people, you were kind of saying, I've got a window here of, a much tighter window to kind of progress within my organization, to get promoted, to kind of hit where I need to get to from a salary perspective and from an experience perspective. Whereas now, people are living much longer. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to see people working much later into their lives than we've become accustomed to. And so as a result of that, to your point, this idea of wanting to spread that time out more evenly across a longer period of time, rather than working very, very intensively for a short period of time and then retiring, is a somewhat different way to look at, how you're constructing your career and how you're constructing your life.
So you talked about the 4-day work week, and that's sort of the most common work reduction schedule that's out there that people know. And on my website, I keep a database of 4-day work week companies. This is how we met, I think, a year or two ago. And I have about 350 companies that have publicly announced, that I can find through the tools I have set up to track this stuff, that are on a 4-day work week schedule, which that would only explain a percentage of all the companies doing it, because not everyone goes out and posts a press release, right, that we've switched to a 4-day work week. So, but regardless, it's probably a pretty small number still. I'm wondering how many, what percentage of companies do you think are using, if you were to guess, a 4-day work week, and how has that grown in the last 3 to 5 years as well?
I would say, based on the data that I've seen, and to your point, Henry, this is not necessarily extremely accurate, based on the fact that, just because they're not putting it up publicly, even in terms of workforce sentiment surveys, you're not getting complete accuracy in terms of some organizations that are offering some of these policies without necessarily, it being a very formalized arrangement. But from what I can tell, we're looking at something like a growth from 2 to 3% of the overall economy to 4 to 5% of the overall economy. So it's still very marginal. The level of adoption is still, it's still not extensive. But where I see this going is that I think that what's happened post COVID is that this has now become enshrined, as we've discussed, as one flexibility model that's available to employers. I think that, you don't have to offer people top of the industry time benefits, financial benefits, and flexibility benefits, but you probably need to be offering at least one or two of those things if you want to be competitive from a talent perspective. And so I think it's inevitable that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years steady incremental growth where more and more organizations, persuaded by the growing evidence that's out there, the data from the trials, the increasing number of case studies of organizations from various different industries finding ways to make this work. I think you're going to see a steady increase of companies based on that. That in turn will lead to further incremental growth based on competition. In other words, as other competitors within industries are offering this, others in turn will see the need. So you're kind of moving from your early adapters to your fast followers. I think that the big question in terms of, will the 4-day work week or the shorter work week or some variation of that ever achieve the kind of, benchmark that the 5-day week does today? Will it ever become the standard work arrangement across the economy? I feel like artificial intelligence is the kind of key determinant of that. As we've discussed, I don't think it's in any way guaranteed that, that this big technological development is going to be necessarily any different to any of the others we've seen. I don't think it's guaranteed that this leads to a reduced hour work week for all. However, I think in terms of what's possible, if you look at most of the companies that have moved to 4-day work weeks, I'm sure most of the 350 on your website, they have done things like automating certain tasks, certain processes. They've used, technology to streamline certain administrative processes. The scope and potential for that kind of activity in the last 12 months alone has grown exponentially. And so there's an opportunity out there, for folks who want to be early adapters of these new technologies, to use work time reduction really as an incentive to drive that change. I think that we may see, work time reduction policies looked at by governments as a way to kind of smooth the curve of disruption that we're going to see in some industries where, there's going to be a lot of jobs which are going to be lost. And I think that shorter work weeks could be a way to kind of create a smoother transition or a smoother curve within some of those industries. I don't think it's going to save jobs, but I think it could certainly help as we kind of upskill and retrain and move to all of the new jobs that inevitably are also going to be created. So I think the jury's out as to what extent AI will drive that change. I think the one thing that maybe is different now to, when we had the last big digital revolution, and I mentioned the advent of the internet and email and so on. I think the one thing that is different is the context around climate sustainability and ESGs, in that, with the way the world is headed on those issues, if AI does drive a very, very significant volume of productivity growth, can we really bank all of that into new consumption in the way we did the last time around? Mm-hmm. I think that probably the answer to that is no from a climate and sustainability perspective. So potentially that could lead to some different choices and some different decisions, which would suggest that reducing work time could be one answer to some of those challenges.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm sure you feel it at your organization. I do. It's, I work for myself. You run your organization, but you can now finally, after playing with AI tools before 12 months ago, like you mentioned, finally with ChatGPT and the other ones catching up, you can basically say, should I hire another contractor for this or use a piece of AI and less of a contractor? Should I do this myself? Should I leverage AI and come in for the close? And you can already feel how your relationship between time and work changing as a result of AI. So it is going to be fascinating to see. Like you said, who knows where it goes, but it's pretty wild. You can already feel it like daily. I feel like at work. Is that impacting you in your organization? How you guys run it all yet, or are you just more thinking about where it might go at this point?
Well, we use it, in our day-to-day work, in a number of different ways. I find it an extremely effective tool if you're using it in the right way.
Yeah.
And I think that training is going to be a very important component of all of this. But, you know, I, I know lots of people where, they use AI to write their LinkedIn posts, they use AI to write articles, they use AI to write proposals. And, the difference in quality between the people who use AI to kind of do the heavy lifting in the middle and kind of use their own expertise to top and tail it in terms of quality prompts at the beginning and then serious refinement at the end is vast. There are, in the same way as it's increasing quality in some places, there are also some places where, anyone that's used ChatGPT even 5 times could look at something and say, that's been written by ChatGPT.
Yes.
So I think that there's a lot of organizations that I feel have adopted a very kind of, open the floodgates and, all they're doing is saying, all of our competitors are using this, we need to start using this without properly thinking through, training, quality, how should this be used? What is an appropriate context? What's not? So yeah, I think we're headed into a very uncertain, but a very exciting 2024 in terms of all of the different possibilities that this technology has opened up for us.
Yeah. Well, you're in a very interesting spot with work time reduction. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about maybe why you started the company and what you guys do?
Sure. So we're a consulting and research organization. We help organizations to move to shorter work weeks, whether that's the kind of very exciting big ticket 4-day work week, whether that's some of the more incremental variations like 9-day fortnights, half-day Fridays, shorter work days. We also work with organizations who are looking for greater time efficiency within their existing work week. So if you take, for example, in professional services, where it is very, very common in places like law or in the agency world, where people are working, 9, 10, 11-hour days as standard, a lot of the tools, the practices, the principles that we use, to help companies move to shorter work weeks can also help those organizations give people some time back within the existing work week. So find the efficiencies that's needed to kind of combat overwork, combat burnout. This is a partnership with a consultancy called Curium Solutions, who have been doing, operational excellence projects for, 20 years now around helping companies find where their 20% worth of inefficiency, waste, unlocked potential resides within their operations. And I think really this is just the natural progression of that, there's a certain amount of efficiencies that you can find just based on re-engineering processes, re-engineering meetings, changing certain work practices. But the potential for that is hugely elevated when you offer your employees the incentive of something like a shorter work week. I think that's always one of the most common things I hear from people is, if we have all of this inefficiency within modern work, why don't we just, find all of those efficiencies and just bank it against the bottom line to save money or to increase revenue? Why would we give that back to employees? But the honest answer is, if it was possible to do that when the only benefit was creating more space for more work, then most organizations would have done this already. The power in this lies in the psychological incentive you're creating for people, where if you give people a challenge and you say, if you can find these efficiencies, we're going to share that benefit directly with you in a way that's life-changing and that's transformative. That is a much more powerful model for organizational change. So I think that's really what lies at the heart of the kind of work that we do.
That's great. Well, I will include links to Work Time Reduction's website, to your LinkedIn, so people can connect. We mentioned the report you released. I'll a link to that. So wherever you're listening or watching, you can sort of follow up with Joe and his organization. So, Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to talk today. Thanks for being here.
No problem. It was a pleasure, Henry. Let's keep in touch.